He was mending a harness when the orc collapsed by his barn. Then she whispered, "The child." The wind had been a wolf at his door all day, clawing at the timbers and howling down the stone chimney. Elian had long ago learned to treat the sound as company. It was a poor substitute for a wife's laughter, but it was something. The blizzard had buried the world in white, erasing the path to the village, erasing the jagged line of the mountains, erasing everything but the small, stubborn reality of his farm. It was a world shrunk to a farmhouse, a barn, and the short, wind-scoured path between them. He liked it that way. A smaller world had fewer places for grief to hide. The harness leather was old and stiff, the threads of its last mending frayed thin. He worked by the low light of a single lantern, the familiar scent of tallow, old leather, and cold iron filling the small space of his workshop. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 small cuts, moved with a slow, practiced economy. This was his life now, a rhythm of small, necessary tasks. Chop the wood, feed the goat, mend the harness, bank the fire, sleep, repeat. It was a life scraped down to the bone, and the quiet of it had settled deep inside him. He finished the last stitch, the waxed thread pulling tight with a faint squeak. It was time for the final check. The goat, the 3 chickens huddled in their coop, the woodpile secure under its oilcloth tarp. He pulled on his heavy cloak, the wool smelling of wood smoke and wet earth, and braced himself. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and driving ice crystals into his face. Snow swirled so thick he could barely see the faint yellow rectangle of his own window just a few paces away. He kept one hand on the rough-hewn wall of the house as he made his way toward the barn, his boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts. The world was a maelstrom of white and sound, and a patch of darkness. It was wrong. A shape against the snow-dusted wall of the barn, a heap of something that didn't belong. His first thought was a fallen tree branch, but the shape was too soft, too rounded. His second thought, colder and sharper, was a wolf, or perhaps a bear driven down from the high peaks by the storm. He tightened his grip on the small hatchet tucked in his belt, its worn wooden handle a familiar comfort. He moved closer, his steps cautious and slow. The wind tore at the shape, whipping a length of dark cloth away to reveal a matted tangle of black hair, then a shoulder covered in crude leather armor, and green skin. Orc. Fear, primal and immediate, seized him. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Orcs didn't come this far south unless they were raiders or scouts for a war party. His farm was isolated, a deliberate choice he'd made after Ilara died, but that isolation was now a trap. No one to call for. No one would even know. He saw the stain in the snow first, a dark, ugly smear spreading out from beneath the figure. Blood. The orc was wounded then, maybe dying. He took another hesitant step, the snow crunching loudly under his boot. The heap stirred. A head lifted, heavy and slow. It was a female. Tusked, yes, but her face was drawn with exhaustion and pain, stripped of the usual ferocity he'd heard about in village tales. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, found his. They held no malice, only a profound, bottomless weariness. She was clutching a bundle to her chest, a lumpy shape wrapped in layers of hide and cloth. She tried to speak, her voice a dry rasp, lost in the shriek of the wind. She pushed herself up on one elbow, a movement that cost her dearly. A shudder of pain racked her body. Her gaze fell from his face to the bundle she held. She shifted, trying to shield it from the wind with her own failing body. And then he heard it. A sound so small and out of place in the raging storm that he almost missed it. A thin, wavering cry. A baby. The world tilted. An orc, a wounded orc female, and her child. The stories didn't tell you about this. They spoke of monsters with axes, of burned villages and screams in the night. They never mentioned the quiet, desperate sight of a mother trying to shelter her infant from a blizzard. Her lips moved again, and this time he heard the words, faint but clear, carried on a gust of wind. The child. Her head fell back into the snow. Her arm, the one holding the bundle, remained locked in place, a final, desperate act of will. Elian stood there for a long moment, the wind and snow a meaningless blur around him. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, bar the door, huddle by the fire, and wait for the storm to pass. Wait for the morning to reveal a frozen mound that was no longer his problem. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He thought of Alara. He thought of the cradle he had carved, sitting empty and dust-covered in the attic. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It plumed white in the frigid air and was instantly torn away. He had made a choice. Getting her inside was a brutal, clumsy affair. She was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone far denser than a human woman. He tried to lift her, his boots slipping in the bloody snow. She groaned, a low, pained sound, but didn't wake. He ended up half dragging, half carrying her, his back screaming in protest. The infant, still clutched in her unyielding grip, remained silent, a small, warm weight against her cold chest. He dragged her across the threshold and into the warmth of his small farmhouse. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the wind, leaving a sudden, ringing silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and his own ragged breathing. He left her on the floor by the hearth, a dark, wet heap on the worn flagstones, and gently, carefully, pried the bundle from her arms. Her fingers were stiff and cold, but they loosened. He unwrapped the layers of hide. Inside, swaddled in surprisingly soft rabbit pelts, was a baby. An orc baby. It was small, with a faint greenish tinge to its skin and a dusting of fine black hair on its head. 2 minuscule white nubs protruded from its lower jaw. It was asleep, its face screwed up, its tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It was, against all expectation, just a baby. He found an old wicker basket, lined it with one of Alara's softest wool shawls, and placed the infant inside, close to the fire, but not too close. Then he turned his attention to the mother. Her armor was simple leather, functional and battered. A deep gash ran along her forearm, sluggishly weeping blood. It looked like a glancing blow from an axe or a sword, crudely bound with a strip of cloth that was now soaked through. He fetched his small stock of medical supplies, a bowl of hot water, clean rags, a needle, gut thread, and the pot of willow bark salve his wife had taught him to make. As he began to cut away the binding, her eyes snapped open. They were sharp now, lucid and dangerous. Her hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Her grip was like iron. Even wounded and exhausted, she was immensely strong. He could feel the power coiled in her, a predator's stillness. "What are you doing?" Her voice was a low growl, rough as gravel. He didn't struggle. He simply held up the clean rag and the bowl of water in his other hand. "The wound, it will fester." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for a trick, a lie. He met her gaze without flinching. He was a farmer, not a warrior. He had no tricks. His face was plain, weathered by sun and wind, and held nothing but a quiet, tired sincerity. "Why?" she demanded, the single word a sharp stone thrown in the quiet room. He looked from her fierce, suspicious face to the basket where her child slept, warm and safe. "The storm is cold," he said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Slowly, cautiously, she released his wrist. But she watched him, every movement, as he cleaned the wound. The gash was deep, the edges ragged. He worked carefully, his hands gentle despite their roughness. He stitched the wound closed with neat, even sutures. She didn't so much as hiss, though he saw the muscles in her jaw bunch tightly. He spread the cool, fragrant salve over the stitches and wrapped her arm in clean linen. When he was done, he stood and ladled some of the thin rabbit stew from the pot over the fire into a bowl. He set it on the floor beside her, along with a cup of water and a chunk of bread. "Eat," he said. He expected another challenge, another question. Instead, she just looked at the food, then back at him. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. She picked up the bowl and began to eat, her movements stiff but deliberate. She ate like a starving animal, without pause, until the bowl was empty. He retreated to his chair on the other side of the hearth, picking up the harness he had been mending. He needed something to do with his hands. The quiet stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. He was acutely aware of her presence, a wild and dangerous element introduced into the placid ecosystem of his life. He could feel her watching him over the rim of the water cup. He kept his eyes on his work, on the familiar motions of needle and thread. He was a fool. This was madness. He had brought a wolf into his home, and for what? A moment of pity? A ghost of a memory? He didn't know. He only knew that the child was safe, and the mother was no longer bleeding in the snow. For now, that had to be enough. The next morning, the blizzard had blown itself out. The world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white under a pale, sunless sky. Elian woke in his chair, a crick in his neck. The fire had been banked, a low bed of glowing coals providing a steady warmth. The orc was gone from her spot on the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, jolted him. He scanned the small room. The basket was still by the hearth. He crept closer and peered inside. The baby was still there, sleeping soundly. He looked around again. The front door was barred, just as he had left it. Then he heard it, A rhythmic, percussive sound from outside. Thunk, crack. He unbarred the door and looked out. The air was frigid, clean, and still. And there she was. She stood by his woodpile, his heavy, splitting axe in her hands. She wore a spare tunic of his, far too small for her broad shoulders, the sleeves barely reaching her elbows. Her movements were powerful, economical. She would set a log on the block, raise the axe high, and bring it down with a single, devastating blow. The wood exploded apart. Thunk, crack. She didn't seem to notice him. She worked with a focused intensity, her breath pluming in the cold air. She was paying her way. She was demonstrating her strength, reminding him, and perhaps herself, that she was not helpless. It was a statement, written in the language of work. He didn't interrupt. He went back inside, rekindled the fire, and made a pot of thin oat porridge. When she finally came in, her face flushed from the cold and exertion, he had 2 bowls waiting on the small table. She paused in the doorway, her eyes flicking to the neatly stacked pile of split wood visible through the open door, a pile that was now twice the size it had been the night before. She gave him a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It was, he understood, an acknowledgement, a truce. They ate in silence, the truce held. The days that followed fell into a new, strange rhythm. A quiet domesticity settled over the farmhouse, fragile as a skin of ice on a puddle. Her name, he learned, was Groker. She offered it one evening as she sharpened his skinning knife with a whetstone, her movements precise and skillful. He offered his own name in return. It was the longest conversation they'd had. Words were sparse between them. They communicated through action. He would rise before dawn to milk the goat, and he would find the fire already lit, a small pile of fresh kindling beside it. He would go out to check his traps and return to find a loose floorboard mended or a leaky bucket patched with a skill he didn't possess. In return, he cared for the child. The baby, who she called Ural, was a placid infant. Elian found he remembered how to hold the child, how to test the warmth of milk on his wrist, how to rock a fussy baby to sleep. The motions came back to him from a life he thought he had buried. Each time he held the small, warm body, it was a dull ache in his chest, a memory of what might have been. But it was a good ache. It was a feeling, and he had been numb for so long. Grocker watched him with the child, her expression guarded but intense. She saw the gentleness in his hands, the patience in his posture. He was no threat to her son. This, more than the food or the shelter, seemed to earn her trust. One evening, a week after her arrival, he fell asleep in his chair by the fire, exhausted from a day of clearing a path to the frozen creek. He woke in the dead of night, the fire burning low. A heavy fur, her own travelling cloak, had been draped over him. It smelled of pine, snow, and her, a wild, clean scent. He looked over. She was sitting on the floor across the hearth, Ural sleeping in a sling against her chest. She was just watching the flames, her face cast in flickering shadow. She didn't look at him, but he knew she was aware he was awake. It was the first truly kind gesture she had made, an act of care that asked for nothing in return. "You are a good male," she said, her voice soft, the words spoken to the fire. Elian didn't know what to say. He just pulled the fur a little tighter around his shoulders and watched the embers glow. The quiet moments by the fire became their confessional. They never spoke of the future, and only in fragments about the past. He found himself talking about Elara. He pointed to the small, intricately carved bird that sat on the mantelpiece. "My Elara made that," he said, his voice thick. "She had such clever hands. She could make anything grow. This farm, it was more her than me." Groker looked at the wooden bird, then at him. "A good mate is a strong shield." It was an orc saying, he supposed, but the sentiment was universal. Another night, as she was mending a tear in Ural's swaddling with a bone needle, she spoke of her own life, her words clipped and spare. "In my clan," she said, her eyes on her work, "the first daughter weaves the war chief's banner. A slow task, many months." The implication hung in the air between them. She wasn't just some outcast. She was important, a first daughter. He didn't ask what clan or who the war chief was. He knew she would tell him what she wanted him to know, no more. He was beginning to understand that her silence was a shield, just like his had been. He was a man who had shrunk his world to the size of a single farm to avoid pain. She had been cast out of a world that was clearly vast and violent, and somehow they had found a temporary peace in this small, shared space, a quiet rhythm of survival against the cold. But the snows were melting. The paths would soon be clear, and he knew, with a cold certainty in the pit of his stomach, that the world she had fled would soon come looking for her. The first sign was a dead rabbit. He found it in one of his snares near the edge of the woods. It hadn't been killed by the wire. Its neck had been snapped, clean and efficient. It was a message. Someone had passed through his snare line. Someone was letting them know they were being watched. He said nothing to Grocka when he returned. He just skinned the rabbit and put it in the stew pot. But the peace of the valley was broken. The quiet felt different now, heavy with listening. He found himself scanning the tree line, looking for shapes that didn't belong. A few days later, he found the tracks. 3 sets, large, booted feet, the prints deep and heavy in the thawing mud. Orcs. They had circled his property, keeping to the cover of the trees, studying the layout of the farm. He followed the tracks for a short distance until he found what he was looking for. Carved into the bark of an ancient oak was a symbol, a tusk, deliberately broken in the middle. He stared at it, his blood running cold. It was a clan marking, a sigil of ownership or intent, a claim. When he got back to the farmhouse, Grocka was outside, splitting the last of the logs they'd brought in before the big storm. She looked up as he approached, took one look at his face, and lowered the axe. "They are here," she said. It wasn't a question. 3 of them, he replied, his voice flat. Scouts, they left a mark on the old oak, a broken tusk. Her face hardened into a mask of stone. All the softness, the fragile domesticity of the past few weeks vanished. She was a warrior again. Vorlag's mark, the Oathbreakers. Vorlag? "My brother," she said, and the word was a venomous curse. She looked toward the mountains, her eyes narrowed. "They will come at dusk. They think a lone female and a human farmer would be easy prey." He looked at his small, peaceful farm, the neat wood pile, the sturdy barn, the curl of smoke from the chimney. It was all so fragile. He wasn't a fighter. He was a man who mended things, who grew things. But he had made a choice the night he brought her in from the snow. He wouldn't unmake it now. "The barn," he said, his mind racing. "The hayloft gives a clear view of the west approach. The woodpile can provide cover from the north. The fence line is weak by the creek. They might try to come through there." He was talking about his home as if it were a battlefield. The thought filled him with a dull, aching sorrow. Groka listened, her head tilted. She gave him a look of grudging respect. "You see the ground well, farmer." "It's my ground," he said simply. They spent the rest of the day preparing. He barred the windows, leaving only small slits to see through. He brought the goat and chickens into the house, their nervous bleating and clucking adding to the tension. He sharpened his hatchet and the largest of his butchering knives. It felt pathetic against the threat of orc warriors. Groka prepared herself. She checked the stitching on his repair of her armor, strapped Urul tightly to her back in his sling, and took up the wood-splitting axe. In her hands, the simple tool looked like a weapon of war. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long purple shadows across the snow-patched valley, they came. 3 large orcs, clad in black iron and cruel-looking furs, emerged from the tree line. They moved with an arrogant swagger, their axes held loosely in their hands. They made no attempt at stealth. This was an execution, not a battle. They stopped 100 feet from the farmhouse. One of them, a massive brute with a scarred face, bellowed, "Groka, the usurper Vorlag demands the whelp. Give us the child, and he will grant you a quick death." The air grew still. Elian's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He gripped his hatchet until his knuckles were white. The farmhouse door creaked open. Groka stepped out. She held the axe loosely, its head resting on the ground. She looked magnificent and terrible, a figure of defiance against the dying light. "I am the daughter of Korgash," she called out, her voice ringing across the clearing like iron breaking. "I do not bargain with oath-breakers and kinslayers." The scarred orc laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Brave words. Let's see if your human pet has any." He pointed a gauntleted finger at Elian, who was now visible in the doorway behind her. "He dies first. Slowly." They charged. Everything became a blur of desperate motion. Groka met the first warrior head-on, her axe swinging in a brutal arc that shattered his shield and bit deep into his shoulder. The orc roared in pain and fury. The other 2 split, one circling toward the side of the house, the other coming straight for the door, straight for Elian. He was their target, the soft spot. Elian did the only thing he could think of. He kicked over a barrel of salted fish guts he kept by the door. The rancid mess spilled across the porch steps. The charging orc hit it, his heavy boots sliding out from under him. He went down with a surprised grunt, landing hard on his back. Elian didn't hesitate. He leaped forward, not with a warrior's cry, but with the desperate grunt of a farmer. He brought his hatchet down on the orc's exposed throat. It wasn't a clean blow, but it was enough. He scrambled back as the 3rd orc rounded the corner of the house. This one was smarter. He ignored Elian and went for Groka's back. She was still locked in a brutal struggle with the injured leader. "Behind you!" Elian yelled. Groka reacted instantly. She shoved the scarred orc away from her and spun, bringing her axe around just in time to block the blow from the 3rd warrior. The impact sent a jarring shock through her body. She staggered back. The scarred leader, clutching his bleeding shoulder, saw his chance. He raised his own weapon for a killing blow. Elian threw his hatchet. It was a clumsy, desperate throw, but it flew true enough, burying itself in the thigh of the scarred orc. He howled and stumbled, his attack ruined. That was all the opening Groka needed. She dispatched the third orc with 2 swift, brutal blows. Then she turned on the wounded, hobbled leader. He tried to raise his weapon, his face a mask of snarling hatred. "For the true war chief," Groka snarled, and brought her axe down one last time. Silence fell. It was over. The clearing was littered with the bodies of the scouts. The pristine snow was trampled and stained. Groka stood panting, her chest heaving. Elian leaned against the doorframe, shaking, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and sick. Groka walked over to him. She looked at the dead orc at his feet, then at him. She reached out and pulled his hatchet from the leg of the dead leader, wiping the blade clean on the corpse's tunic before handing it back to him. "You fight like a farmer," she said. There was no mockery in her voice. "I am a farmer," he managed to say. "A farmer who bleeds for my son." She looked at him, her dark eyes holding an intensity that made his breath catch. "They will send more. Vorlag will not stop." He knew she was right. This small victory was just a reprieve. He looked at the bodies, at the blood on the snow, at the violated peace of his home. "Tell me everything," he said. And so she did. By the light of the fire, with the bodies of her brother's assassins lying cooling in the yard, she told him the truth. She was Groka, daughter of Korgash, the war chief of the Ironfang clan, a powerful clan from the northern Frostspine Mountains. Her father had been a strong and respected leader, but her brother, Vorlag, was ambitious and cruel. He had formed a pact with a rival clan, murdered their father in his sleep, and blamed the assassination on loyalist captains. He'd seized the title of war chief, his claim held together by fear and the blades of his blood-sworn followers. She, as the only other direct heir, and her newborn son, Ural, who carried the direct bloodline of Korgash, were the only remaining threats to his legitimacy. She had been forced to flee her own home, hunted by her own people, with only a handful of loyal guards who had sacrificed themselves one by one to buy her time. She had been running for weeks, making for the southern lands, where she hoped to find sanctuary or disappear. Elian listened, the scale of it all pressing down on him. This wasn't just a family feud. It was a civil war. He had been harboring not just a refugee, but a political fugitive, a queen in exile, and her son was a king. A profound sense of inadequacy washed over him. He felt small, his entire life a tiny, insignificant footnote in her epic, brutal story. He had offered her shelter, a warm fire, a mended tunic. She was fighting for the soul of her people. The connection he had felt building between them suddenly felt like a lie, a misunderstanding. She hadn't seen him, Elian, the man. She had seen a port in a storm, a temporary convenience. The intimacy of their shared silence felt like a fraud. He was a tool she had used to survive. He felt a sharp, bitter pang of betrayal. even though he knew it was irrational. She had done what she had to do, but it hurt nonetheless. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Would you have helped me if you knew?" She countered, her gaze unwavering. "Would you have invited a war to your door for a stranger?" He didn't have an answer. Before he could find one, a horn blast echoed through the valley. It was a deep, resonant sound, full of menace. Another followed, and then another, from different directions. They were surrounded. Vorlag had not sent a larger scouting party. He had brought his army. The siege began without negotiation. A volley of black-fletched arrows rained down, thudding into the walls and roof of the farmhouse. One hissed through the open doorway and buried itself in the wall just inches from Elian's head. He slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy bar into place. His home, the sanctuary he had built with his own hands, the last remnant of his life with Elara, was now his prison and his fortress. The assault was relentless. Heavy logs were used as battering rams against the door and the walls. Orcs clawed at the window shutters, their snarling faces appearing in the gaps. Groka moved through the small house like a storm, a whirlwind of deadly grace. She used the axe to smash hands that reached through the windows, her own knife to stab through cracks in the timbers. Elian fought beside her. He was not a warrior, but he was a man defending his home. He used what he had. He poured the pot of boiling stew through a hole in the roof onto the warriors below, their howls of pain a grim satisfaction. He used a fireplace poker as a spear, jabbing at anyone who came too close to the windows. He fought with the desperate, clever tenacity of a cornered animal. But they were losing. The door was splintering. The roof had caught fire from a flung torch, and smoke was beginning to fill the room. The bleating of the goat turned into a scream of terror before being abruptly cut off. Through the din, a voice louder than the rest roared. "Sister, your human filth is burning. Your help will be next. Face me." Vorlag. The battering ram slammed against the door one last time, and it exploded inward in a shower of splinters. Orc warriors poured into the room. The fight became a chaotic, close-quarters melee. Elian found himself back-to-back with Groka, his small knife a pathetic toothpick against orcish longswords. He stabbed, dodged, and kicked, surviving on pure instinct. Then he saw him. A massive orc, larger than the rest, wearing armor of black plate and a horned helmet. Vorlag. He cut down one of his own warriors who was in his way and advanced on Groka, a cruel smile on his face. "It is over, sister," he boomed. The fighting around them seemed to slow as the two siblings faced each other. Warriors from both factions, Vorlag's bloodsworn and those who still held loyalty to their old war chief's line, paused to watch. Groka stood her ground, her axe held ready, her son still strapped to her back. She was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her face smeared with soot, but her eyes burned with defiance. She didn't look at her brother. She looked past him, her gaze sweeping over the assembled warriors. Then, her eyes found Elian. In that moment, amidst the fire and blood and chaos, she made her move. It was not an attack. It was a declaration. "Warriors of the Iron Fang," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "You follow a kinslayer, a man who broke the blood oath. My son, Urul, son of Korgash, is the true heir to the war chief's seat." A murmur went through the crowd of orcs. Vorlag laughed. "Your son, your half-breed pet, he will never rule." "He will rule," Groka said, her voice dropping but carrying with an absolute authority. and he will have a protector, one who has shown more strength and honor than any of you." She pointed her axe, not at Vorlag, at Elian. "This human, Elian, stood against you when you would have butchered a mother and her child. He gave us his hearth and home. He bled for my son. I name him Hearth-keeper of my line, first protector of the air. When I retake my father's hall, he will stand beside me, not as a slave, as my mate." The world stopped. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence from the assembled orcs. Vorlag's jaw dropped. Elian stared at her, his mind reeling. Mate? It was a formal offer, a public declaration, a political act of profound defiance. She was elevating him, a lowly human farmer, to a position of honor in her clan, tying his fate directly to hers and her son's. It was an insult to Vorlag, a challenge to every tradition her people held. Vorlag recovered first, his face purple with rage. "You would disgrace our bloodline with this thing? I will kill him myself." He charged at Elian, but something had shifted. Before Vorlag could reach him, two older orcs, their armor bearing the faded sigil of Korgash, moved to intercept him. "The challenge is made, Vorlag," one of them growled. "The old ways must be respected." Grokka's gamble had worked. She had fractured his support, appealing to the deep-seated traditions that even a usurper like Vorlag couldn't entirely ignore. Chaos erupted as warrior turned on warrior. The battle was no longer a siege, but a civil war fought in the burning ruins of Elian's home. Grokka grabbed Elian's arm. "We must go, now!" She led him through the swirling melee, the loyalist orcs forming a brief protective corridor for them. They burst out of the back of the collapsing farmhouse and ran, plunging into the darkness of the woods as the structure that had been Elian's entire world finally collapsed behind them in a roar of flame and timber. He looked back once at the orange glow against the night sky. He had lost everything: his home, his peace, his solitude. Grokka stopped under the cover of the ancient pines, turning to him. In the dim light filtering through the trees, he could see the question in her eyes. She had made her public offer. He had not yet given his answer. He thought of his empty life before she had arrived, the quiet, monotonous days, the hollow ache of loneliness he had mistaken for peace. He looked at her, at the fierce, proud woman who had seen something in him worth declaring to the world. He looked at the sleeping child on her back, a symbol of a future he never thought he would have a part in. He was still just a farmer. But maybe that was enough. "You offered me a place beside you," he said, his voice steady. She nodded, watching him intently. "I did." "I accept," he said. He took a breath, the cold air biting his lungs. He needed her to understand. This was not about protection or status. It was about partnership. But on my own terms. A flicker of surprise and perhaps respect showed in her eyes. "Name them." "I will not hide that I am human. I will not be your pet or your dependent. I will stand with you, not behind you, and you will teach me to fight." A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes. "Then stand, Elian of the hearth," she said, "and I will teach you how to break them." They fled into the mountains, a small, desperate band, a warrior queen, her infant son, a human farmer, and a handful of grizzled orc loyalists who had chosen honor over power. The first few months were the hardest. Elian was a stranger in a strange world. The other orcs, even the loyal ones, treated him with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. He was small, weak in their eyes, a liability. He didn't know their customs, couldn't speak their language beyond a few harsh-sounding words Groka taught him. He was an outsider in every sense of the word. He didn't try to win them over with words. He used his hands. While the warriors practiced their blade work, Elian was the one who knew how to build a smokeless fire that wouldn't give away their position. When a leather strap on an orc's armor broke, it was Elian's skilled fingers that stitched it back together, stronger than before. He taught them how to set snares that caught more than just rabbits, how to find edible roots, which berries were poison and which were not. He showed them how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find clean water. His strength was not in the swing of an axe, but in the quiet, steady competence of survival. He was a nurturer, a builder, a mender. In a group focused entirely on destruction and reclamation, his skills were an oddity, but they were undeniably vital. Slowly, grudgingly, he earned their respect. It wasn't given in praise, but in small actions. An older orc named Grak, who had been openly hostile at first, began leaving the best piece of meat by the fire for him. Another, a young female scout named Isha, started quietly asking him to check the tension on her bowstring before she went on patrol. They stopped calling him the human and started calling him Elian. Groka kept her promise. Every evening, after Urul was asleep, she trained him. Her methods were brutal and unforgiving. She taught him how to hold a blade, how to use his smaller size to his advantage, how to fight with cunning, not just brute force. He was clumsy at first, his body not used to the violent economy of combat. He ended most sessions bruised, exhausted, and covered in mud. But he never quit. He learned. Their bond, forged in the fire of his burning home, deepened in the quiet moments between the struggle. They were partners in all things. They planned the next move together, his caution tempering her aggression. He would care for Urul while she met with potential allies, his gentle rocking a stark contrast to the fierce warrior she had to be. One night, months later, they were camped in a high mountain pass. They had won a small skirmish, rallying a few more families to their cause. Groka was preparing for the next day's council, strapping on the pieces of armor they had scavenged and repaired. A pauldron was giving her trouble, the strap just out of her reach. Elian stepped behind her without a word and fastened it. His fingers, sure and familiar, brushed against her skin. It was a simple, domestic act, an echo of 100 other quiet moments they had shared. He finished, but his hands lingered on her shoulders. She leaned back against him slightly, a rare moment of vulnerability. "My brother thinks strength is a loud voice and a big axe," she said quietly, staring out at the moonlit peaks. He is wrong. Strength is a fire that burns steady through the longest winter. It is the patience to mend what is broken. It is the courage to shelter a child. She turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his. That is your strength, Elian. It is the strength my people have forgotten. It is the strength a true war chief needs. He didn't need to say anything. He understood. He had not been chosen despite being a farmer. He had been chosen because of it. He was the balance to her sword, the hearth to her fire. In his old life, he had been a man defined by what he had lost: his wife, his future, his connection to the world. Now he was being defined by what he had found: a purpose, a family, a home, not of wood and stone, but of loyalty and love, built in the heart of a rebellion, beside a woman made of iron and a child who held the future in his tiny fists. He had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. And he had chosen to stand, not in the ashes of his past, but in the dawn of their shared future.